Have you ever wondered what happens when love blooms in the heart of a battlefield? When choosing to care for someone could cost you everything you hold dear, including your life? When a single glance across enemy lines becomes an act of rebellion that could destroy not just you, but everyone you've sworn to protect? In the autumn of 1944, as Allied bombs fell like deadly rain over Belgrade and partisan fighters crept through shadowed streets, something extraordinary happened. Something that defied every rule of war, every boundary of loyalty, every expectation that divided nations had created about who deserved love and who deserved hatred. Tonight, I'm going to share with you one of the most dangerous and forbidden love stories to emerge from the Second World War. A tale that will challenge everything you think you know about courage, sacrifice, and what happens when the human heart refuses to recognize the artificial borders that politics draws between souls. This is the story of Milika and Captain Heinrich Weber, two people who should have been enemies, two people whose love affair was so perilous, so impossible, that discovery would have meant execution for both of them. Yet somehow, against odds that seemed insurmountable, they found each other in the chaos of occupied Belgrade and dared to believe that love could survive in a world gone completely mad. Before we dive into their extraordinary journey, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just another wartime romance. This isn't just a tale of star-crossed lovers caught in circumstances beyond their control. This is a testament to the power of individual choice to transcend the hatred that entire nations try to force upon their people. Their story proves that even in humanity's darkest hour, when evil seemed to triumph and hope appeared lost, two hearts could still find a way to rebel against everything the world demanded they become. I spent months researching this account, piecing together fragments from resistance archives, military records, and testimonies that survived the liberation of Belgrade. What I discovered was a love story so incredible, so heart-stopping, and so impossible that it reads like the most dramatic fiction. But every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every life-threatening choice actually happened in the streets and safe houses of a city under siege. Milika Petrovic was 19 years old in the autumn of 1944, a university student who had watched her country disappear beneath the boots of foreign armies. She came from a family of teachers and poets, people who believed in the power of words to change the world. Before the war, she had dreamed of becoming a journalist, of traveling to distant places and telling stories that mattered. Instead, she found herself carrying messages through Belgrade's underground tunnels, her education in literature transformed into lessons about codes, safe houses, and how to kill a man with nothing but a kitchen knife. The partisan movement had claimed her not through ideology, but through necessity. When her older brother was executed for distributing anti-occupation leaflets, when her father disappeared into a prison camp that might as well have been a death sentence, Milika discovered that neutrality was a luxury her conscience could not afford. She joined the resistance not because she loved war, but because she loved the idea of a world where her younger sister could grow up free. Captain Heinrich Weber was 28 years old, a career officer who had been stationed in Belgrade to help maintain order in what German High Command considered a restless but strategically vital territory. He had studied philosophy at the University of Vienna before the war, had read Goethe and Schiller by candlelight in his family's modest apartment, had dreamed of teaching literature to young minds eager to understand the beauty that human beings could create with language. The uniform he wore represented everything Milika had been trained to destroy. Yet beneath that gray wool and polished leather lived a man who wrote poetry in margins of military reports, who sent most of his salary home to support his widowed mother, who had begun questioning orders that felt increasingly disconnected from any recognizable notion of honor or human decency. Their first meeting was not romantic. It was not planned. It was a moment of pure chance that could have ended in tragedy for both of them and everyone they cared about. Milika had been tasked with delivering intelligence about German troop movements to a resistance cell operating near the city center. The information was crucial, time-sensitive, and dangerous enough that 3 previous messengers had been captured attempting the same mission. She moved through Belgrade's bombed-out streets like a ghost, using routes that partisan scouts had mapped through rubble and abandoned buildings. The October morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that might have been beautiful if the city hadn't been scarred by years of occupation and resistance. Milica had almost completed her journey when Allied aircraft appeared over Belgrade, their engines growing louder as they approached targets throughout the German-held sectors of the city. The air raid sirens began their familiar wail, a sound that had become the soundtrack of daily life in occupied Belgrade. Citizens scattered toward whatever shelter they could find, while German soldiers took positions to defend strategic installations from the bombing runs that had become increasingly frequent as Allied forces pushed deeper into the Balkans. Milica found herself trapped in a courtyard behind what had once been a bookshop, now reduced to broken windows and scattered pages that fluttered like wounded birds in the morning breeze. The building offered no adequate shelter from the bombs that were already beginning to fall, but moving into the open street would expose her to both Allied aircraft and German patrols that shot suspicious civilians without asking questions. She pressed herself against a brick wall, clutching the leather satchel that contained intelligence reports worth more than her life, and waited for the bombing to end. The explosions grew closer, shaking dust from the damaged buildings around her, sending tremors through the ground that she could feel in her bones. That was when Captain Weber appeared in the courtyard entrance, his face grim with the professional concern of an officer responsible for civilian safety during air raids. He had been conducting a routine patrol when the sirens began, and his training demanded that he ensure non-combatants reached appropriate shelters before the bombing intensified. For a moment that felt like eternity, they stared at each other across the courtyard. Milica saw a German uniform, the symbol of everything she had sworn to resist, everything that had destroyed her family and her country. Heinrich saw a young woman alone and vulnerable, someone who needed protection from the death falling from the sky above Belgrade. Both of them understood that this encounter could end in multiple ways, most of them tragic. Milica's hand moved instinctively toward the knife concealed in her coat, while Heinrich's training told him to question any civilian found in restricted areas during military operations. The intelligence she carried would be worth torture and execution if discovered. The oath he had sworn demanded that he treat any suspicious person as a potential threat to German security. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Something that defied every rule of war, every boundary of loyalty, every rational calculation of risk and reward. Heinrich stepped forward and spoke in careful Serbian, his accent thick but his words unmistakably concerned. He told her that the basement of a nearby church offered better protection from the bombing, that staying in the courtyard was dangerous, that she needed to move quickly before the next wave of aircraft arrived. Milica found herself following this enemy officer through streets that had become a maze of rubble and broken dreams, her mind racing with questions that had no safe answers. Why was he helping her? What did he want in return? Was this some elaborate trap designed to capture resistance operatives, or was she witnessing something that seemed impossible in the context of their war-torn world? The church basement was crowded with Belgrade citizens who had learned that survival often depended on the kindness of strangers, regardless of what uniforms those strangers might wear. Heinrich guided Milica to a corner where she could sit with her back protected, where the intelligence she carried would be safe from prying eyes, where she could wait for the all-clear signal that would allow her to complete her mission. He left her there with nothing more than a brief nod, returning to his duties as the bombing continued above their heads. But something had passed between them in that courtyard, something that neither could name or explain, something that would grow into the most dangerous relationship either had ever imagined. When the all-clear finally sounded, and Belgrade's citizens emerged from their shelters to assess the latest damage, Milica completed her mission with mechanical precision. She delivered the intelligence, received new orders, and returned to the safe house where she lived under a false identity. But her mind remained focused on a German officer who had chosen to protect rather than interrogate, who had seen her as a human being rather than a potential enemy. Heinrich returned to his quarters and wrote a routine report about civilian casualties and structural damage from the morning's air raid. But he found himself thinking about dark eyes that had held fear and courage in equal measure, about a young woman who had trusted him enough to follow his directions to safety, about the moment when helping someone in danger had felt more important than following military protocol. Neither of them expected to meet again. Both assumed that their brief encounter would fade into the collection of small wartime kindnesses that helped people maintain faith in human decency despite everything they witnessed around them. They were wrong. Fate, as it often does during wartime, had different plans entirely. 3 days later, Milica found herself assigned to gather intelligence about German defensive preparations in the same sector where Heinrich conducted his regular patrols. The resistance needed detailed information about troop strengths, weapon placements, and communication networks that could help partisan forces plan coordinated attacks once Soviet troops reached Belgrade's outskirts. The mission required multiple reconnaissance visits, careful observation of German military routines, and the kind of patient intelligence gathering that distinguished professional resistance operations from desperate acts of sabotage. Milica would need to become invisible in plain sight, moving through occupied territory like a ghost while documenting everything that could help liberate her city. On her second surveillance mission, she encountered Heinrich again. This time, there was no air raid to provide cover for their meeting, no convenient excuse for why a German captain might approach a young Serbian woman in broad daylight. No emergency that would justify the conversation they both somehow knew was inevitable. Heinrich was inspecting checkpoint procedures when he noticed her standing near a newspaper kiosk, pretending to read headlines that proclaimed German victories on distant fronts. But he recognized the way she held herself, the careful alertness that marked someone accustomed to danger, the subtle tension that suggested she was far more interested in the military convoy passing nearby than in propaganda about battlefield triumphs. Their eyes met across the busy street, and both felt that same electric recognition that had sparked in the bookshop courtyard. This time, however, there was no immediate crisis to explain their mutual awareness, no bombs falling to justify why they seemed drawn to each other despite every rational reason to remain strangers. Heinrich made a decision that violated every aspect of his military training. Instead of questioning a suspicious civilian or reporting unusual behavior to his superiors, he walked away from his checkpoint duties and approached the woman who had been haunting his thoughts for 3 sleepless nights. Milica watched him cross the street with a mixture of terror and anticipation. Every instinct screamed that she should run, that engaging with an enemy officer was suicide, that the intelligence mission she was conducting could be compromised by a single moment of weakness. Yet something about his approach suggested not aggression, but the same inexplicable concern that had led him to guide her to safety during the bombing. When Heinrich reached the newspaper kiosk, he spoke in Serbian that was more confident than their first encounter, his accent still noticeable but his vocabulary surprisingly sophisticated. He asked if she was well, if she had found adequate shelter during recent air raids, if she needed assistance navigating the increasingly dangerous streets of occupied Belgrade. The questions were innocent enough to avoid suspicion from passers-by, yet personal enough to confirm that their previous meeting had affected him as profoundly as it had affected her. Milica found herself responding with careful politeness, thanking him for his concern, while maintaining the fiction that she was simply a Belgrade citizen, trying to survive another day of occupation. But beneath their surface conversation flowed undercurrents of meaning that neither dared acknowledge openly. Heinrich was telling her that he remembered their encounter, that he had thought about her safety, that he was willing to risk his position to ensure her well-being. Milica was communicating that she recognized his kindness, that she understood the danger he was accepting by approaching her, that something in his character transcended the uniform he wore. Their conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes, no longer than a casual exchange between strangers who had shared a moment of crisis. Yet both understood that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, entered territory that was forbidden not just by military regulation, but by the fundamental logic of their war-torn world. Heinrich returned to his duties with the knowledge that he had begun something that could destroy his career, his reputation, possibly his life. Milica continued her reconnaissance mission carrying intelligence that could help kill German soldiers, while her mind remained focused on a German officer who seemed to embody everything she had been taught to hate, yet who treated her with a gentleness that made her question assumptions she had never thought to examine. Over the following weeks, their encounters became more frequent and more deliberate. Heinrich began timing his patrols to coincide with hours when Milica conducted her surveillance operations. She started choosing observation points that would bring her into contact with the German officer, whose presence had become both thrilling and terrifying. They developed a careful choreography of accidental meetings, each encounter brief enough to avoid suspicion, yet meaningful enough to deepen their understanding of each other. Heinrich would pause to ask about civilian concerns, military restrictions, the availability of food and medical supplies. Milica would respond with information that was truthful but carefully edited, providing insights into Belgrade life while concealing anything that might compromise resistance operations. These conversations revealed layers of complexity that neither had expected to discover in someone they were supposed to consider an enemy. Heinrich spoke about his studies before the war, his love of literature, his concerns about the direction German policy was taking in occupied territories. His words carried a melancholy that suggested he had not chosen his current path willingly, that circumstances beyond his control had placed him in a uniform he wore with increasing reluctance. Milica shared memories of Belgrade before the occupation, her dreams of journalism, her family's traditions of education and intellectual curiosity. She spoke carefully but honestly about the changes war had brought to her city, the way entire ways of life had disappeared almost overnight, the resilience she had witnessed among people who refused to surrender their dignity despite losing everything else. Through these fragmented conversations, conducted in full view of a city under martial law, they began to discover that their fundamental values were far more compatible than their opposing allegiances would suggest. Both believed in the importance of education, the power of literature to illuminate human nature, the responsibility of individuals to protect those weaker than themselves. More dangerously, they began to recognize in each other a kindred spirit, someone whose moral compass pointed toward compassion rather than hatred, whose conscience wrestled with choices that seemed to offer no perfect solutions. Heinrich saw in Milica a woman whose courage was matched by her intelligence, whose commitment to her people was tempered by her refusal to dehumanize their oppressors. Milica found in Heinrich a man whose uniform could not disguise his essential decency, whose position of authority had not corrupted his capacity for empathy. The turning point in their relationship came during a particularly intense bombing raid in early November. Soviet forces were approaching Belgrade from the east, and Allied aircraft were increasing their attacks on German defensive positions throughout the city. The bombardment was more severe than anything Belgrade had experienced, with explosions that shattered windows blocks away from their targets and fires that filled the sky with smoke that blocked out the autumn sun. Milica had been observing German artillery emplacements when the bombing began, her position exposed on a rooftop that offered excellent surveillance opportunities, but no protection from aircraft that might mistake her for a military observer. The building shook with each nearby explosion, and she realized that staying in place was certain death, while attempting to reach street level would expose her to shrapnel and falling debris. Heinrich appeared on the rooftop, as if summoned by her desperation, having abandoned his post to search for civilians trapped in the most dangerous areas of the bombardment zone. When he saw Milika crouched behind a chimney that offered minimal shelter, his military training overcame every other consideration. He crossed the exposed roof under fire, reached her position, and guided her toward a stairwell that might provide access to better protection. The journey down through the damaged building became a nightmare of collapsed floors, blocked passages, and structural damage that made every step potentially fatal. Heinrich led the way, testing each floor beam before committing their weight to it, clearing debris that blocked their path, creating handholds where stairs had been destroyed by previous bombing runs. When a particularly close explosion brought down part of the ceiling directly above them, Heinrich threw himself over Milika, shielding her body with his own while chunks of masonry crashed around them. For long moments they lay pressed together in the darkness, breathing dust and listening to the sound of the building settling around them, both acutely aware that survival depended entirely on trusting someone they were supposed to consider an enemy. In that moment of shared vulnerability, surrounded by evidence of war's capacity to destroy everything human beings built and cherished, something fundamental shifted between them. The artificial barriers of nationality and military allegiance seemed suddenly meaningless compared to the simple fact that they were two people helping each other survive. Two souls who had found connection in the midst of chaos, designed to tear all connections apart. When they finally reached the basement shelter, both were covered in dust and blood from minor cuts, their clothes torn and their faces marked by the terror they had shared. Other civilians in the shelter looked at them with the understanding that comes from witnessing strangers risk everything to help each other, the recognition that war sometimes created bonds stronger than those destroyed by conflict. Heinrich stayed with Milika until the all-clear sounded, their conversation no longer constrained by the careful boundaries they had maintained during their previous meetings. They spoke about fear, about the randomness of survival, about the way violence could strip away everything except the most essential human qualities. For the first time, Heinrich admitted his doubts about the war, his growing conviction that military objectives were being pursued without adequate consideration for human cost. Milika acknowledged her own fears, not just of death, but of what hatred was doing to her people, the way resistance sometimes demanded choices that compromised the very values they were fighting to preserve. When the bombing ended, and Belgrade emerged once again to count its wounds, both Heinrich and Milika understood that their relationship had evolved beyond the careful neutrality they had tried to maintain. They had moved from mutual recognition to genuine care, from intellectual compatibility to emotional connection that transcended every boundary their world had tried to impose between them. The danger they now faced was no longer simply the risk of discovery by suspicious authorities. They were confronting something far more threatening to their carefully constructed identities as enemies. They were falling in love with someone they were supposed to kill, finding in each other exactly what their war-torn hearts most desperately needed, discovering that the most profound act of rebellion might be refusing to hate someone the world demanded they destroy. The weeks that followed their shared ordeal in the collapsing building became a careful dance between desire and survival, between the growing connection they could no longer deny and the deadly consequences that discovery would bring. Belgrade was transforming around them as Soviet forces drew closer to the city, bringing with them the promise of liberation and the threat of a final, desperate battle that could destroy everything they had come to cherish about their secret world. Heinrich found himself volunteering for duties that would bring him into contact with civilian populations, ostensibly to gather intelligence about resistance activities, but actually to create opportunities for the encounters that had become essential to his sanity. Each conversation with Milika felt like stolen time, precious moments carved from a reality that seemed determined to tear them apart before they could fully understand what they meant to each other. Milica discovered that her reconnaissance missions had evolved beyond their original military purpose. She still gathered intelligence about German defensive preparations, still reported troop movements and weapon placements to her resistance contacts, but her observations had become colored by personal knowledge that complicated everything she thought she understood about their enemy. Through Heinrich, she learned that many German soldiers were as trapped by circumstances as the people they occupied. Young men who had been conscripted from farms and universities, who wrote letters home describing their homesickness and their doubts, who followed orders not from ideological conviction but from the simple desire to survive long enough to return to families they might never see again. This knowledge created a crisis of conscience that Milica struggled to resolve. How could she continue planning operations that would kill men who were themselves victims of the same forces that had destroyed her family? How could she reconcile her love for a German officer with her duty to a resistance movement that depended on viewing all occupiers as enemies worthy of death? Heinrich faced his own moral labyrinth as his relationship with Milica deepened. His position gave him access to intelligence about planned anti-partisan operations, sweep arrests that would target civilians suspected of resistance sympathies, reprisal actions designed to terrorize Belgrade's population into complete submission. The information he possessed could save lives if shared with the right people, but sharing it would make him a traitor to every oath he had sworn, every principle his military education had instilled in him. Yet how could he remain silent when he knew that innocent people would die, that families would be destroyed, that the woman he was falling in love with might be swept up in operations designed to crush exactly the kind of courage she embodied? The uniform he wore felt increasingly like a costume, a disguise that concealed his true nature rather than expressing it. Their meetings became more elaborate and more dangerous as November progressed toward the winter that would bring Soviet liberation to Belgrade. They developed a system of signals using seemingly innocent actions, a dropped handkerchief to indicate danger, a particular route through the market to suggest a desire to meet, a book left on a specific bench to communicate messages too sensitive for verbal exchange. The complexity of their communication reflected the deepening intimacy of their connection. They were no longer simply two people who had helped each other survive bombing raids. They had become confidants who shared their deepest fears, their most precious memories, their dreams for a future that seemed impossible given the circumstances that had brought them together. Heinrich told Milica about the small Bavarian village where he had grown up, about winter mornings when frost covered the fields like crystal lace, about his mother's garden where she grew roses that bloomed despite the harsh mountain climate. He described the university lectures that had shaped his understanding of literature and philosophy, the professors who had taught him that education was a form of resistance against ignorance and hatred, the books that had convinced him that human beings were capable of creating beauty even in the darkest times. Milica shared stories of her family's traditions, the Sunday afternoons when her father would read poetry aloud while her mother prepared meals that filled their apartment with the scents of herbs and love, the conversations about journalism and truth-telling that had inspired her dreams of documenting the world's beauty and injustice. She described the Belgrade of her childhood, a city where different cultures and religions had coexisted with the kind of tolerance that seemed miraculous in retrospect, where education and arts had flourished despite economic hardships that would have crushed less resilient communities. These conversations created an alternative universe where nationality and military allegiance meant nothing compared to shared values and mutual understanding. In the bombed-out corners of Belgrade where they met, surrounded by evidence of war's destructive power, they constructed a relationship based on everything that violence could not touch, could not corrupt, could not destroy. But their private world existed within a larger reality that was growing more dangerous with each passing day. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance, a constant rumble that promised liberation for some and destruction for others. German defenses were being reinforced throughout Belgrade, with new checkpoints that made movement more difficult and surveillance operations that threatened anyone whose behavior seemed suspicious. Milika's resistance cell was preparing for the final phase of operation that would support Soviet forces as they entered the city. The intelligence she had gathered about German defensive positions would be crucial for coordinated attacks designed to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing military effectiveness. Her comrades trusted her completely, never suspecting that her access to German military information came from sources they would consider treasonous. Heinrich received orders that filled him with dread. His unit was being assigned to anti-partisan operations that would target civilian areas where resistance fighters were suspected of operating. The missions would involve house-to-house searches, mass arrests, interrogations that he knew would involve torture, reprisal executions designed to terrorize Belgrade's population into complete submission. The moral crisis that had been building throughout their relationship reached its breaking point when Heinrich learned that Milika's neighborhood was scheduled for a comprehensive sweep operation. Every building would be searched, every resident questioned. Anyone whose identity could not be satisfactorily established would be detained for further investigation. The operation was designed to capture resistance operatives, but Heinrich knew it would also result in the arrest and likely execution of dozens of innocent civilians, whose only crime was living in an area where partisan activity had been reported. He faced a choice that would define not just his own future, but his understanding of what it meant to be human in circumstances that seemed designed to strip away all humanity. He could follow his orders, participate in operations that would almost certainly result in Milika's capture and death, and preserve his position within a military structure that had become morally repugnant to him. Or he could warn her, save the woman he loved, and accept the consequences of betraying everything he had once believed about duty and loyalty. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable despite the magnitude of its implications. Heinrich chose love over duty, conscience over orders, the future he dreamed of sharing with Milika over the past that had brought him to Belgrade in a uniform he no longer wanted to wear. Their meeting to discuss the impending danger took place in the basement of a church that had been damaged by bombing, but still served as an unofficial gathering place for Belgrade civilians seeking comfort in community and prayer. The setting was appropriate for a conversation that would determine whether their love could survive the ultimate test of competing loyalties. Heinrich's warning was delivered with military precision, every detail about timing, personnel, and operational procedures shared with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence briefing. But his voice shook as he described what would happen to resistance operatives who were captured, the interrogation methods that would be used, the reprisal executions that would follow any attempt at armed resistance. Milika listened with the calm attention of someone accustomed to receiving life-or-death intelligence, but her mind was racing beyond the immediate tactical implications of Heinrich's warning. The information he was sharing would save not just her own life, but the lives of countless civilians who would be caught in the sweep operation. More importantly, his willingness to share it represented a choice that could never be undone, a line crossed that would make him as much a traitor to his cause as she was to hers. Their conversation in that damaged church became a negotiation about survival, about loyalty, about the kind of future they might create together if they both managed to live through the chaos that was approaching Belgrade. Heinrich was offering to do more than simply warn her about immediate danger. He was proposing to provide ongoing intelligence that could help resistance operations while minimizing casualties on both sides, to use his position to protect civilians while undermining military activities that served no purpose except terrorizing an already defeated population. The offer represented everything Milika's resistance training had taught her to hope for, the kind of intelligence asset that could transform their capabilities and save hundreds of lives. Yet accepting Heinrich's help would make her complicit in his treason, would bind their fates together in ways that went far beyond personal affection, would create obligations and dependencies that might prove impossible to fulfill when liberation finally came to Belgrade. More troubling still was the question of what would happen to Heinrich when German forces inevitably retreated from Yugoslavia. Would Soviet liberators distinguish between German officers who had committed atrocities and those who had helped resistance operations? Would Milika's testimony about his assistance be enough to protect him from summary execution, or would his uniform condemn him regardless of his actions? The uncertainty of their future created an urgency that transformed their relationship from careful courtship into something approaching desperation. They were no longer simply two people falling in love despite impossible circumstances. They had become partners in a form of resistance that could save lives while destroying their own, allies whose survival depended on trusting each other completely, while knowing that discovery would mean death for both of them. Their first collaboration began immediately, with Heinrich providing detailed information about the planned sweep operation that allowed Milika's resistance cell to evacuate vulnerable civilians and relocate sensitive materials before German forces arrived. The operation proceeded as scheduled, but found only empty buildings and frightened families whose suspicious behavior could not be proven, whose stories about normal civilian activities could not be definitively contradicted. The success of their intelligence sharing created both exhilaration and terror. Heinrich watched German forces waste time and resources searching for resistance operatives who had vanished like smoke, knowing that his information had made the difference between success and failure. Milika observed her comrades' amazement at intelligence that seemed impossibly detailed and accurate, their growing confidence in operations that had previously been desperate gambles against overwhelming odds. Yet both understood that their collaboration had created new dangers that went beyond the risks they had accepted individually. Heinrich's access to sensitive information would be scrutinized more carefully if German operations continued to fail, while Milika's suddenly accurate intelligence would raise questions about sources that she could never safely answer. They were walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss, balanced between the love that gave their lives meaning and the secrets that could destroy everyone they cared about. Each successful operation brought them closer to discovery, while each day of survival deepened their connection to something that transcended every boundary their world had tried to impose between them. The winter of 1944 was approaching, bringing with it the final chapter of Belgrade's occupation and the ultimate test of whether love born in war's shadow could survive the transition to whatever peace might follow. Neither Heinrich nor Milika could predict what form that peace would take, or whether there would be room in it for a relationship that had been forged in defiance of everything their respective sides held sacred. But they had chosen each other over every other loyalty, had committed themselves to a future that existed only in their shared imagination, had discovered that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply refusing to hate someone the world demanded they destroy. Refusing to hate someone the world demanded they. As December arrived in Belgrade, the sound of Soviet artillery grew closer each day, a rhythmic thunder that promised liberation and threatened destruction in equal measure. The city held its breath, caught between hope and terror, while Heinrich and Milika navigated the most dangerous phase of their impossible relationship. Their intelligence collaboration had evolved into something neither had anticipated when they first shared that warning about the sweep operation. Heinrich found himself providing information that went far beyond protecting Milika's safety, sharing details about German defensive strategies, supply routes, and troop movements that helped partisan forces plan operations with surgical precision. The moral weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical burden. Each piece of intelligence he passed to Milika represented another step away from everything his military education had taught him about honor and duty. Yet watching Belgrade's civilians suffer under increasingly desperate German policies had convinced him that his true loyalty belonged not to abstract concepts of national allegiance, but to the people whose lives hung in the balance of every decision made by men in uniforms who had never walked these bombed-out streets. Milika struggled with her own form of moral complexity, as she became the conduit between Heinrich's intelligence and resistance operations that grew bolder with each success. Her comrades attributed their remarkable string of victories to improved reconnaissance and better coordination with approaching Soviet forces, never suspecting that their most valuable intelligence came from a German captain who was systematically betraying his own army. The deception required her to live multiple lives simultaneously. During resistance meetings, she presented herself as a dedicated operative whose remarkable intuition about German plans had made her invaluable to their cause. In her encounters with Heinrich, she became a woman torn between love and loyalty, grateful for his help while terrified of the consequences his assistance might bring to both of them. Their meetings had evolved beyond the careful choreography of their early encounters. The urgency of approaching liberation made elaborate precautions feel like luxuries they could no longer afford. Instead, they developed a system of communication that relied on split-second timing and absolute trust in each other's ability to read subtle signals that would be invisible to anyone else. Heinrich would leave coded messages in books at a small lending library that had somehow survived the bombing, using a system they had devised based on their shared love of literature. Page numbers and underlined words created sentences that conveyed military intelligence, while appearing to be nothing more than a student's study notes. Milika would respond through similar methods, confirming that information had been received and acted upon, sometimes adding personal messages that reminded Heinrich why he was risking everything to help her. The intimacy of their communication created a relationship that existed primarily in the realm of imagination and possibility. They were partners in the most dangerous enterprise either had ever undertaken, yet their actual time together remained limited to brief encounters that felt stolen from a reality determined to keep them apart. When they did meet, usually in the basement of bombed buildings or abandoned shops that offered temporary shelter from patrols and surveillance, their conversations carried an intensity that reflected the knowledge that each encounter might be their last. Heinrich would describe the growing chaos within German command structures as officers realized that Belgrade was becoming indefensible. That retreat was inevitable despite official orders to hold the city at any cost. Milika shared intelligence from Soviet forces about liberation plans, about the political arrangements being negotiated for post-war Yugoslavia, about the uncertain fate that awaited German personnel who remained in Belgrade when partisan and Soviet forces arrived. These conversations revealed that their personal crisis existed within a larger transformation that would reshape everything they had known about their world. The approaching end of German occupation raised questions that neither wanted to confront directly, but that haunted every moment they spent together. What would happen to Heinrich when Soviet forces reached Belgrade? Would his assistance to the resistance be enough to protect him from summary execution, or would his uniform mark him for death regardless of his actions? Could their relationship survive the transition from wartime secrecy to whatever form of peace emerged from the rubble of occupied Yugoslavia? Heinrich had begun making preparations for possibilities he could not discuss even with Milika. He had destroyed personal documents that might implicate him in activities that incoming Soviet authorities would consider war crimes, had created false papers that might allow him to disappear into the chaos of retreating German forces, had even considered the possibility of desertion if it meant surviving to build a future with the woman who had become more important to him than his own life. Milika faced her own preparations for an uncertain future. Her resistance activities had given her connections within partisan leadership, relationships that might provide influence when decisions were made about the treatment of German personnel who had aided their cause. Yet she also understood that protecting Heinrich might require her to reveal the nature of their relationship, a disclosure that could compromise her own position within a movement that might not approve of romantic connections with enemy officers. The tension between their personal feelings and their public obligations reached a breaking point in mid-December when Heinrich received orders that filled him with despair. His unit was being assigned to oversee the evacuation of German civilians from Belgrade, a mission that would require him to participate in activities designed to deny the approaching Soviet forces any potential intelligence assets or local support networks. The evacuation orders were particularly cruel because they targeted Belgrade residents who had collaborated with German authorities, often people who had been forced into cooperation by circumstances beyond their control. Families who had provided translation services, individuals who had worked in German administrative offices, shopkeepers who had sold supplies to occupying forces would all be relocated to camps in Austria, where their fate would be determined by authorities who viewed them as traitors to their own people. Heinrich knew that many of these evacuees were innocent civilians who had simply tried to survive an impossible situation, people whose cooperation with German authorities had been motivated by hunger, fear, or the desire to protect their families rather than ideological support for occupation policies. The orders he had received would force him to participate in what amounted to collective punishment for an entire population whose only crime had been living under German rule. More troubling still was the possibility that Milica might be identified as someone whose behavior during the occupation warranted investigation. Her ability to move freely through German-controlled areas, her apparent knowledge of military procedures, her success in avoiding detection during security sweeps might all be interpreted as evidence of collaboration rather than resistance activity. The irony was devastating. Heinrich's love for Milica and his desire to protect her had led him to provide intelligence that made her one of the most effective resistance operatives in Belgrade. Yet that same effectiveness might now mark her as a suspected collaborator, whose relationship with German personnel required examination by Soviet security services that were not known for their subtlety in distinguishing between genuine traitors and innocent victims of circumstance. Their next meeting took place in conditions of heightened danger that reflected the chaos consuming Belgrade as German forces prepared for evacuation. Soviet artillery was now close enough that individual shell impacts could be distinguished, while partisan sabotage had disrupted communications and transportation networks throughout the city. German patrols had become more aggressive and unpredictable, while civilian populations were caught between conflicting orders from retreating occupiers and advancing liberators. Heinrich's description of the evacuation orders created a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The woman he loved might be classified as a security risk by the very forces he was helping to facilitate, while his participation in operations targeting suspected collaborators would make him complicit in activities that violated every principle their relationship had taught him to value. Milica listened to his report with growing horror, understanding that their intelligence collaboration had created exactly the kind of suspicious pattern that would attract attention from Soviet counterintelligence officers looking for evidence of German infiltration networks. Her success as a resistance operative had been built on information that could only have come from high-level German sources, a connection that would be impossible to explain without revealing Heinrich's role in her activities. The basement where they met seemed to shrink around them as they contemplated the magnitude of their dilemma. They had spent months building a relationship based on trust and mutual support, yet the approaching liberation threatened to transform their greatest strength into their most dangerous vulnerability. The love that had sustained them through the darkest period of Belgrade's occupation might now become the instrument of their mutual destruction. Heinrich's solution was characteristically direct and completely terrifying. He proposed that they abandon their separate identities and flee Belgrade together, disappearing into the chaos of retreating German forces while creating new lives in whatever remained of Europe after the war ended. The plan would require them to abandon everything they had known, everyone they had loved, every connection that tied them to their previous existences. For Heinrich, the sacrifice would mean deserting his unit, abandoning his mother in Bavaria, accepting permanent exile from a country that would mark him as a traitor for the rest of his life. For Milica, it would mean betraying her resistance comrades at the moment of their greatest triumph, leaving her younger sister to face an uncertain future alone, turning her back on the liberation she had risked her life to achieve. Yet the alternative seemed even more impossible to contemplate. Staying in Belgrade meant accepting that their relationship would be exposed to Soviet authorities, who might view Heinrich as a war criminal regardless of his assistance to the resistance, while treating Milica as a suspected collaborator whose romantic involvement with a German officer called her loyalty into question. The choice they faced was not simply between love and duty, but between different definitions of what love and duty actually meant. Heinrich argued that their obligation to each other transcended their obligations to abstract concepts like nationality and political allegiance, that the connection they had discovered was more valuable than any cause that would demand its destruction. Milica countered that abandoning their responsibilities to family and community would poison their relationship with guilt and regret that might prove more destructive than any external threat they currently faced. Their debate continued through the night as Belgrade trembled under artillery fire that grew closer with each passing hour. Soviet forces were approaching the city's outskirts, while German defensive positions crumbled under the combined pressure of external assault and internal sabotage that Heinrich's intelligence had helped to orchestrate. The sound of distant gunfire provided a soundtrack to conversations that felt like negotiations for their souls, discussions that required them to define not just what they wanted from each other, but what they were willing to sacrifice to achieve it. Every option seemed to demand the destruction of something essential to their identities. Every choice appeared to lead toward different forms of loss that might prove equally devastating. As dawn approached over Belgrade, bringing with it the possibility that Soviet forces might reach the city center within hours, Heinrich and Milica realized that their time for deliberation was ending. The decisions they made in the next few days would determine not just their individual fates, but the ultimate meaning of everything they had shared during the months when their impossible love had flourished in the shadow of war. The choice that lay before them was both simple and infinitely complex. They could trust that their love was strong enough to survive whatever trials lay ahead, or they could accept that some connections are too dangerous for the world to allow. They could fight for the future they had imagined together, or they could sacrifice that future to protect the people and principles they had served before they found each other. Belgrade was about to be liberated, but Heinrich and Milica faced a different kind of freedom, one that would require them to choose between different versions of themselves, different definitions of courage, different ways of honoring the love that had transformed them both during the darkest winter of their lives. The morning of December 18th, 1944, brought news that changed everything. Soviet artillery had breached the outer defensive ring around Belgrade, and partisan forces were launching coordinated attacks throughout the city. The liberation that had seemed like a distant possibility just weeks earlier was now unfolding with terrifying speed, bringing hope and chaos in equal measure to a population that had survived 3.5 years of occupation. Heinrich received his final orders at dawn, delivered by a staff officer whose hands shook as he spoke. All German personnel were to begin immediate evacuation procedures. Non-essential equipment would be destroyed to prevent capture. Civilian assets deemed valuable to enemy forces would be relocated or eliminated. The systematic dismantling of German presence in Belgrade was to be completed within 72 hours, after which the city would be abandoned to approaching Soviet and partisan forces. The orders contained a section that made Heinrich's blood run cold. Intelligence personnel were specifically tasked with conducting final security sweeps to identify and neutralize potential threats to retreating German forces. Anyone suspected of resistance activities, collaboration with approaching Soviet units, or possession of sensitive information would be detained for interrogation and possible elimination. The list of criteria for detention was broad enough to encompass virtually anyone whose behavior during the occupation had been less than completely transparent. Milika's name was not on any official list, but Heinrich understood that her pattern of movement, her apparent immunity to previous security operations, and her presence in areas where German plans had been compromised would make her a prime candidate for investigation. The intelligence that had made her so valuable to the resistance would now mark her as a priority target for German forces desperate to prevent their operational secrets from falling into enemy hands. He had perhaps 6 hours before the security sweeps began, 6 hours to warn Milika and help her disappear into the chaos of a city transforming itself from occupied territory into liberated ground. The communication methods they had developed over months of careful collaboration were useless in this crisis. There was no time for coded messages in library books, no opportunity for elaborate signals that required hours to implement. He would have to find her directly, despite the enormous risk such contact would create for both of them. Meanwhile, Milika was experiencing her own form of desperate urgency as partisan forces prepared for operations that would support the advancing Soviet army. Her resistance cell had been activated for missions that would begin within hours: coordinated attacks on German communication networks, supply depots, and administrative centers that would accelerate the collapse of occupying forces while minimizing damage to Belgrade's infrastructure. The intelligence Heinrich had provided over the past weeks had been synthesized into operational plans of remarkable sophistication. Partisan forces knew exactly which German positions were lightly defended, which supply routes could be interdicted with minimal risk, which communication centers controlled networks essential to coordinated retreat. The success of these operations would save hundreds of lives while ensuring that German evacuation proceeded in chaos rather than good order. Yet Milika found herself distracted by concerns that went beyond military objectives. Heinrich had not made contact according to their usual schedule, a break in routine that could indicate anything from operational security concerns to capture by German authorities. The silence felt ominous in ways that her intelligence training told her to ignore, but that her heart refused to dismiss. Her resistance commander noticed her distraction during the final briefing, commenting on her apparent preoccupation when absolute focus was essential for mission success. Milika forced herself to concentrate on tactical details, memorizing target locations and emergency procedures, while part of her mind remained focused on a German officer whose fate had become more important to her than her own survival. The irony of her situation was almost unbearable. She was preparing to participate in operations designed to destroy the military organization that Heinrich served, actions that might result in his death, even if German security forces never discovered their relationship. The intelligence he had provided was being used to plan attacks that could kill him, while her success as a resistance operative might ultimately depend on information that came at the cost of his life. Heinrich's search for Milika began in the late morning, conducted under cover of security duties that gave him legitimate reasons to move through areas where civilian populations might be hiding resistance operatives. His familiarity with her patterns of movement and preferred locations provided advantages that he hoped would compensate for the limited time available to warn her of approaching danger. The Belgrade he moved through was transforming before his eyes. German checkpoints were being abandoned or consolidated as personnel were reassigned to evacuation duties. Civilian populations were emerging from hiding places they had occupied during the most intense periods of occupation, testing the boundaries of new freedoms while remaining uncertain about what liberation would actually mean for their daily lives. The sound of Soviet artillery was now constant, a rumbling thunder that provided a soundtrack to the city's transition from one form of authority to another. Smoke from burning German installations mixed with dust from buildings damaged by increasingly accurate bombardment, creating an atmosphere that seemed to reflect the uncertainty that surrounded everyone's future. Heinrich found Milika at the third location he searched, a bombed church that had served as one of their regular meeting places during quieter periods of their relationship. She was conducting surveillance of German evacuation activities, documenting vehicle movements and personnel strengths for intelligence reports that would be transmitted to partisan commanders within hours. Their reunion was both relief and terror, joy at seeing each other alive mixed with awareness that this meeting might expose them both to dangers they could no longer control. Heinrich's uniform made him a target for partisan snipers who were beginning to operate throughout the city, while Milika's presence in an area under active German surveillance created risks that went beyond their personal safety. His warning was delivered with military brevity that concealed the depth of his fear for her safety. The security sweeps would begin within hours, targeting anyone whose activities during the occupation suggested possible resistance connections. Her documented presence in restricted areas, her apparent ability to avoid previous security operations, and her pattern of movement through sectors where German plans had been compromised would make her a priority target for interrogation and possible execution. Milika listened with the professional calm of someone accustomed to receiving life-threatening intelligence, but Heinrich could see the fear in her eyes as she calculated the implications of his warning. Her resistance cell was depending on her participation in operations scheduled to begin that evening. Disappearing now would compromise missions that could save hundreds of lives while ensuring successful liberation of Belgrade. Yet staying would almost certainly result in capture by German forces, who were unlikely to be interested in distinguishing between resistance operatives and innocent civilians. The choice she faced was starker than any they had confronted during their months of careful collaboration. She could abandon her comrades at the moment of their greatest triumph, preserving her own life while potentially dooming operations that depended on her intelligence and expertise. Or she could accept the risk of capture, completing her duties to the resistance while understanding that Heinrich's warning might represent their final conversation. Heinrich's response to her dilemma revealed the depth of transformation their relationship had created in his understanding of loyalty and duty. He offered to provide information about the planned security sweeps to her resistance contacts, intelligence that could help them avoid capture while completing their missions. The proposal would make him an active participant in operations designed to kill his fellow German soldiers, the final step in a journey that had already taken him far beyond any boundary he had previously imagined crossing. But his offer came with conditions that reflected the desperation of their situation. After providing the intelligence that could save her comrades, he wanted Milika to disappear with him into the chaos of German evacuation, abandoning Belgrade before Soviet forces completed their occupation of the city. They would create new identities, find refuge in neutral territory, build a life together in some corner of Europe, where their past allegiances would not determine their future possibilities. The plan was both romantic and terrifying, a complete abandonment of everything that had defined their identities in favor of a future that existed only in their shared imagination. Heinrich was proposing that they become different people entirely, refugees from a war that had consumed their homelands, while creating a connection between them that transcended every boundary their previous lives had contained. Milika's response revealed the complexity of her own transformation during their months of secret collaboration. She wanted nothing more than to disappear with Heinrich, to abandon the weight of expectations that had shaped her existence, Since her brother's execution had forced her to choose sides in a conflict she had never wanted to join. Yet she also understood that deserting her resistance cell would betray every sacrifice made by people who had trusted her with their lives, every principle that had sustained her through the darkest periods of occupation. Their debate was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles, German security forces beginning the sweeps that Heinrich had warned her about. The irony was cruel beyond measure. His information had been accurate, but their meeting to discuss it had extended too long, trapping them together in a location that would be searched within minutes. Heinrich's training took control of his actions, overriding personal feelings in favor of tactical necessities that might keep them both alive. He guided Milika toward a section of the church that had been damaged by previous bombing, where collapsed roof beams created hiding spaces that might escape casual inspection. The concealment was far from perfect, but it represented their only chance of avoiding immediate discovery. They pressed themselves into a gap between fallen masonry and twisted metal, their bodies close enough to feel each other's heartbeat, while German soldiers conducted their search of the building above them. The voices of Heinrich's fellow officers echoed through the damaged structure, professional and methodical as they examined every corner that might conceal resistance operatives or compromising evidence. For 45 minutes, they remained motionless in their improvised shelter, breathing dust and listening to footsteps that sometimes passed within feet of their hiding place. The search was thorough but not exhaustive, conducted by men who were more interested in completing their assignment quickly than in discovering every possible hiding spot in a building that had been damaged beyond practical use. When the security forces finally moved on to other locations, Heinrich and Milika emerged from their concealment covered in debris and marked by the terror they had shared. The close call had demonstrated both the accuracy of Heinrich's intelligence and the impossibility of their situation. They could not continue meeting in Belgrade as Soviet forces completed their occupation, yet they could not communicate effectively without the personal contact that had sustained their relationship through months of impossible circumstances. Heinrich made his final offer with the quiet desperation of someone who understood that time had run out for half measures and careful compromises. He would provide complete intelligence about German evacuation procedures, security arrangements, and defensive preparations to Milika's resistance contacts. The information would enable partisan forces to maximize their success while minimizing casualties on both sides, ensuring that Belgrade's liberation proceeded with minimal destruction to the city's infrastructure and civilian population. In exchange, he asked only that Milika consider the possibility of a future that neither of them could clearly envision, but that both had begun to hope might exist beyond the boundaries of their war-torn world. Whether that future involved fleeing Belgrade together or finding each other after the chaos of liberation had settled into whatever form of peace emerged from the rubble of occupied Yugoslavia, Heinrich wanted her to know that his feelings transcended every loyalty that had previously defined his existence. Milika's answer came not in words, but in actions that revealed the depth of her own commitment to their impossible relationship. She kissed him in the ruins of a church that had witnessed centuries of human struggle, surrounded by evidence of war's capacity to destroy everything people built and cherished, yet also by proof that some connections could survive even the most determined attempts to tear them apart. Their kiss was both goodbye and promise, acknowledgement that they might never see each other again, an affirmation that what they had discovered together was worth any sacrifice their world might demand. When they separated, both understood that they had crossed the final boundary between the lives they had lived before they met and the people they had become through loving each other despite every obstacle their circumstances had created. Heinrich returned to his duties carrying intelligence requests that would help save lives while endangering his own. Milika rejoined her resistance cell with information that would ensure their operation succeeded, while knowing that success might cost her the person who had become more important to her than victory itself. Both faced the approaching liberation of Belgrade with hearts that were simultaneously full of hope and breaking with the possibility of permanent loss. The city around them continued its transformation from occupied territory to liberated ground, while two people who had found each other across enemy lines prepared to discover whether love born in war's shadow could survive whatever peace might follow. Their story was approaching its climax, but neither could predict whether that climax would bring reunion or tragedy, fulfillment or devastation, the future they had dreamed of together, or the separation that duty seemed to demand. The story of Milika and Heinrich reminds us that even in humanity's darkest chapter, love found ways to transcend the artificial boundaries that politics carved between souls. Their forbidden romance proves that individual conscience can triumph over collective hatred, that two hearts can rebel against everything the world demands they become. While we may never know if they survived the chaos of liberation to build the future they dreamed of together, their courage to choose love over loyalty, compassion over conflict, continues to echo through history. Sometimes the greatest act of resistance is simply refusing to hate someone the world tells you to destroy.